Welcome back to another Kentucky Derby profile here on Racing Rundown. On today's video, we're going to be discussing Mage, the runner-up from the Florida Derby in this year's Kentucky Derby. Mage is trained by Gustavo Delgado, who has had two previous Kentucky Derby starters, all very big outsiders, both, I should say, very big outsiders. Mage is certainly going to be the shortest price of the three horses that he's run in the Kentucky Derby, and Mage made a little bit of news this week as he picked up Javier Castellano, who is still searching for a first Kentucky Derby win, and Javier Castellano took off of Raise Cane to ride Mage, which is certainly a somewhat of an endorsement on Mage if you want to look at it that way. I'm personally choosing to look at it as a statement against Raise Cane and not necessarily in the pro of Mage. But if you're someone who likes to read in the lines between that, that's certainly a route that you can take. But with that being said, before we get to this, I do just want to mention down below the link to the playlist where we have the links to the other Kentucky Derby profiles. Be sure to check those out. Next week, we will have our Kentucky Derby preview and also our Kentucky Oaks preview. So Kentucky Derby week, all that is stuff to look forward to. Now, let's get to Mage. One of the more lightly raced horses going into this year's Kentucky Derby, only 3 starts. And if you remember last year, that was something that I harped on big time. I was right in every occasion when I harped on it, and I'm going to harp on it again. But we're going to just take a look at Mage before we get into talking about the intricacies of his races. So he broke his maiden in very good fashion, just under 4-length victory, going 7 furlongs. Should be mentioned there has been some somewhat decent form coming out of that race. Perform, who was 4th in that spot, won the Federico Tessio at Laurel. So stakes form coming out of that race. And he took that maiden effort and was well backed against Forte in the Fountain of Youth. He ended up going off as the co-second choice with Blazing Sevens in that race. Was beaten 4th there, but he did have a bit of an excuse in that spot because he did hit the gate he did hit the gate at the start, and that kind of messed with him a little bit. So, you can kind of forgive him a little bit for that 4th place effort. And then he ran a very exceptional race in the Florida Derby, moving up in trip there with Forte. And it looked like for a moment, and not just a moment in the stretch, maybe about half of that stretch, like he was going to win there. Forte was not traveling off the turn, and it looked like Mage, who at that point he had put away Cyclone Mischief, was going to handle Forte. Forte wasn't really going to make his run, and then Forte kicked it in when they got to the 16th pole and ended up winning by a comfortable length there. But that effort that Mage turned in was enough for people to say, Mage is a legitimate horse, and Mage is going to be a somewhat wise guy-ish horse going into this year's Kentucky Derby. Is he going to be, a short-priced horse, like single digits? No, but I would not be surprised to see him middle double digits, high teens at the most, because I know that there are a lot of people who like him, and I think he's going to potentially be one of those wise guy horses, and if not a wise guy horse, a horse that people talk about as one to hit the board in this year's Kentucky Derby. So with only 3 starts, there's not really a whole lot more to get into in terms of his starts. Speed figures, just kind of, he's kind of average in the pack with those speed figures. Is 88 and 89, not really, kind of really ran the same race if you're looking at it from the metric standpoint. As I said, you can kind of forgive the effort, or not kind of, you can forgive the effort in the Fountain of Youth because he did hit the gate there. And then he did improve going into the Florida Derby. And, a lot has been made about Forte potentially regressing from the Fountain of Youth into the Florida Derby. That certainly isn't something that Mage has had to contend with. So that's my first pro for him, is he did improve in the Florida Derby in many fashions. So it was a good step forward from his maiden. His maiden effort was a nice win, and he gave the 2-year-old champion a scare for half the length of the stretch. So that's certainly something that you have to give him credit for. And he did get it, and that kind of segues into my second pro, is he got a lot closer to Forte in the Florida Derby than he did in the Fountain of Youth. Now, I did mention that there was the excuse that he had in the Fountain of Youth with hitting the gate there, but was much closer to beating Forte than he was, and really has been the closest that anybody has been to beating Forte since Loggins in the Breeders' Futurity back in October of last year. So that's certainly something to take into account with him. And then he also handled being wide well in the Florida Derby. And as a horse who's going to be coming from that probably third flight between 8 to 12 range, it's very likely that he will have to be wide in the Kentucky Derby this year. And if he's coming from last or next to last, like he did in the Florida Derby, then that's going to be something that's going to be even more of a thing that he'll have to contend with being wide. So the fact that he was able to handle being wide so well in the Florida Derby is certainly a positive sign for him going into the Kentucky Derby. But we get into the cons. I want to talk about one of them. The easiest one is he hasn't beaten Forte yet. On 2 occasions, he was second best to Forte both times. So while you can give him credit for running the good runner-up effort behind Forte in the Florida Derby, he was still beaten by Forte. Forte wasn't really traveling until he kicked it in. And then once Forte kicked it in, he had plenty left to get by Mage, and not just get by Mage with some to spare also. It was eventually a length margin of victory there. So that is probably the simplest thing on the surface level. But it's also worth mentioning he hasn't raced against winners, or he hasn't won while facing winners yet. Now, he has obviously faced tough winners in graded stakes races, but he hasn't won outside of the maiden level yet. So that's not one of my major cons, but that's something that I want to bring up there. The other thing that I would bring up is he hasn't won going 2 turns yet. His maiden effort came going 7 for his maiden win came going 7 furlongs. Now, again, very good effort placing in the Florida Derby. I'm not necessarily saying that this is a horse that isn't going to get the 2 turns, but I would certainly be more comfortable with him if he had a win going around 2 turns. I don't know what the stats are for horses going into the Kentucky Derby without a win at 2 turns. I would imagine they aren't very good because there's a long history of the Kentucky Derby, and most of the time horses get the opportunity to have a win going into the Kentucky Derby at 2 turns. Now, I'm not saying every horse has done that, but I would imagine that the numbers for horses having not won at 2 turns are not very good. So that's another con, but my major one is that he didn't race at 2. And I see this talking point brought up every single year, and I keep having to remind people and sort of rein you back in, no pun intended there, is that ever since Justify won the Kentucky Derby, there has been pretty much a move to abandon concern about horses that didn't run at 2. And you get a lot of people that say, well, it doesn't really matter. Well, why doesn't it really matter? Well, because Justify won the Kentucky Derby. Justify was one horse in 136 years. And I said this last year when we were talking about horses like Taba, Charge It, and Zozos. For every Justify, there's 10 of those horses. There's 10 horses like Zozos who run 2 really good races in non-stakes company, get a placing in a Kentucky Derby and get a placing in a Kentucky Derby prep and get into the Kentucky Derby. Now, Mage isn't exactly the same, isn't exactly following the same trip to the Kentucky Derby as Zozos did, but very similar. 3 starts going into the Derby. Their final prep was a very good placing effort behind the favorite in the Kentucky Derby, and Mage will probably get a little bit more backing than Zozos did, but that's a horse that I would compare Mage to. And Zozos ran 10th in the Kentucky Derby, so Mage could very likely be a horse that will improve going forward through the remainder of his 3-year-old campaign. But he's only got 4. He's only going to have 3 starts going into the Kentucky Derby, and I'll take this from another route. So there have been only 3 horses in the history of the Kentucky Derby going back to 1900. I can't say in the history of the Kentucky Derby, but there's only been 3 horses since 1900 that have won the Kentucky Derby with 3 lifetime starts. One of those was Justify, the other one was Big Brown, and the other one was Regret, who won the Kentucky Derby in 1915, famously. So those are not great numbers for horses like Mage going into the Kentucky Derby. Again, Zozos, 3 lifetime starts last year. Charge It, 3 lifetime starts. These are horses that were nice horses before they had run in the Kentucky Derby. But they did not have the seasoning. And Mage isn't a Pletcher horse, but we see these horses every year brought to the Kentucky Derby that through the benefit of the point system, they got a late start, but they got a good run in a prep race, and that got them to the Kentucky Derby, and they're just not ready for it. Mage is likely just not going to be ready for the Kentucky Derby this year. And I have the general rule of thumb, unless this horse is a bona fide Triple Crown winner, you gotta have, my minimum is 5 starts going into the Kentucky Derby. I'd obviously like to see more, but at a bare minimum, there's got to be 5 starts in a horse before the Kentucky Derby, unless they're a bona fide Triple Crown winner. Mage is far from a Triple Crown winner. And so for that reason, I'm going to be against Mage in this Kentucky Derby. I'm not saying that I'm going to toss him pre-Kentucky Derby, pre-draw. But he's a horse that I'm going to be against this year because of the lack of experience. That's really the big thing that I have going for him, or that I have going against him, with a side of he hasn't beaten Forte on 2 occasions. So with that being said, that's going to be it for this Kentucky Derby profile. As I mentioned, be sure to check out the playlist in the description below to check out the other Kentucky Derby profiles that we are going to be releasing over the course of this week. We will see you next time. Have a good one.